on the email list.
We should have a couple of people doing it.
Need someone to take notes? I can help.
Thanks, Eric. We'll get someone else to take over when you're presenting. So let's jump into the agenda. Anything we need to say about NoteWell? I think everybody understands the IP rules here. So this is what we have for an agenda today. It's actually 2 slides, kind of busy. Let's take a few minutes and see if we want to make any changes to the agenda. So we've got Nancy's going to do a status update for RIV. Kathleen's going to talk about attestation sets. And then Dave Thaler will talk about RATS architecture. Hank is then up with interaction models, TUDA, and then attestation results claims for suit. And then Jeremy's going to take us through CBOR tags for unprotected CWT claims. And then Eric's going to take a few minutes on Yang and attestation event stream subscription, and then we have 10 minutes for use cases, and then 25 minutes for open mic. So if there's some other topics that we know we want to talk about, we could throw those out now, or otherwise that's going to be our overflow time for today, given this is such a full agenda.
And it looks like Roman's in the queue. Our AD.
Roman.
I think if we have time either today or at the next session, I see that we have a few milestones that are in the past. So if we could use that time to just clean that up and figure out what's the realistic deadline for them. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Anything else? If not, then let's move on to the first topic, which is the status update. So I guess, Nancy, do you want me to share?
Well, I don't have any slides. It's just more, it's more a question and discussion and direction from Roman, our AD. So the RIV draft has gone through working group last call. I did the final review as I was writing up the Shepherd write-up, and I noticed there's quite a few drafts that are being referenced, like the architecture, like the Chara draft, which makes sense. It also references interaction models and TUDA. Interaction models we adopted a couple of sessions ago, but the TUDA is yet to be a working group draft. That said, there are references to several drafts that are still under work or not adopted yet. And so, Roman, I didn't know whether you wanted us to wait until we got a little further with the drafts and package them together, or whether we can start going through the IESG publication review now, knowing that it's got some dependencies on drafts that are not done yet.
Right, that's a great question. I mean, worst case scenario, if we push that document through, you would be sitting in misref for a while on the back end, waiting for the other ones to catch up process-wise. So let me take a look, and I'll have an answer tomorrow when we meet again, because the concern might be, and I've had that concern myself on other documents, and I've seen the other ADs do as well, where if they see the reference to something that looks very immature and it's fairly crucial because it's a normative reference to a key part of that architecture, they might have the inclination to send the document back because they said they can't judge this one without being able to read the other one in details if the working group isn't close. So it's a bit of a judgment call, and let me kind of poke at it a little bit. But based on all the links you kind of talked about, and especially since some of the normative dependencies aren't even adopted in the working group, it might seem like we want to wait a little longer, not necessarily for the others to be done, but for it to be fleshed out a little bit more in the working group.
Okay, I can forward you the list because as I was doing the write-up, I had the list, which I think I sent you in an email, but let me dig it up again and I'll send them
For
to
which
you.
I apologize
But if
because I
you
did see that email.
Yeah, that's all right. This is why we're doing the update here. So if you can let us know, right, I'll know which way to take action. Yep.
Will do.
That's it. Thanks.
We have Eric in the queue.
Eric,
you
you're in the
asking for
queue?
Yeah, just piece of information for Roman is that nothing is normative. It's just a couple informational things. So that makes it hopefully a little easier.
It really does make it a lot easier. I apologize. I did not look at the references in those documents. So let me take a squint. But if they're informational, I think that's a different ballgame. Thanks, Eric.
Okay. Any other comments? If not, let's move on to the attestation sets. Kathleen.
Good morning. Okay, so this is, it's a pretty simple draft. And the reason for it is over the past few years, I've been really focused on how do we scale security better? And, just thinking about those bigger problems that we have a 3.5 million person deficit in security professionals. I don't think training is what's going to get us through that deficit. I think we have to start thinking about how we do things and doing them differently so that we scale better. And so one of the small pieces of that is when I've been reviewing the architecture documents and EAT and documents and attestation even outside of the IETF, I've been thinking about, how do we scale better? And I did a little work while I was at Dell, so you'll see that there are Dell reviewers on this. And so if this goes forward, I'll likely add one of them as a co-editor. So essentially, we have, so anyone who's been in the SACM working group, who has worked on SCAP, knows that there's a lot of challenges still for posture assessment. There's a number of organizations who are able to do it, but they typically are ones that have good resources on site. So smaller organizations who don't have that level of skill just aren't able to deploy and have their systems assessed on a regular basis. It's just too difficult, or even deploying an image to a standard could be difficult. So the idea here is to shift that back to the vendor and to have posture provided with attestation locally and then a summarization given back with an EAT. So some of the challenges with the current models is that every organization requires an expert. So how do we get rid of that demand for an expert at each location? And it's shifting it back, because if we do attestation and set that up at the vendor, which could be an application provider, it could be a container, it could be anything in the stack, the operating system, parts of the operating system, noting some of the challenges Michael had posted in response to reading the draft. And for those who didn't read that message, essentially just, if you have one component relying on the validation of a prior component before attestation can happen, the system can hang or the application can hang until that's corrected. And so, there are obviously challenges still using attestation, but having those attestation set by the vendor with, measurement ranges that could work. Policy configurations to different levels is one way where we might be able to get to a point where people could just have an easy button and select, I'm going to implement the CIS benchmark for Kubernetes. And let's say it's even at different levels because you have different requirements. You could just click that button and have that attested configuration. And then over time, you can still do at runtime attestations to have assurance of that state being continued. And so the idea here is how can we push this type of, built-in security model and attestation being provided continuously to businesses of any size, regardless of resources. Next slide. Now, I was at Dell for 13 years before I made my recent move. So my exposure was, in terms of implementations was, what happens with the TPM and the firmware and the boot cycles. And so with that, systems are booted up and they largely match to NIST 800, or they match to NIST 800-193. And that's been further instantiated in a TCG document for reference integrity measurements. Right, so they are going against a set of items as they go up the stack. And it happens, the verification happens at boot and also at runtime. They also happen locally. If something doesn't quite match, it can, the system can wait for that to match or restart a process to ensure that the system's integrity is as expected. And so if you consider that a set, then what if we just provided an attestation over, let's say, the evidence of that entire set completing, which could be, in this case, the TPM logs, and then that could be put into an EAT. And, I don't know how we would want to do that, if it's just a URI to logs or the actual log file, which might be big. But then just that complete set would be provided in a remote attestation as opposed to each individual attestation. Because if you're thinking about managing thousands of systems, how would you pull in all of the attestations for an entire set and then, make them remote? So that just, in my mind, doesn't scale. And so the idea of doing this in a set seems to make more sense. And you could use whatever, just like the architecture document says, you could use whatever interface you want to transfer that set attestation to the repository or governance, risk, and compliance system, however you're going to do it. Next slide, please. So what does that look like? This picture is from the NIST 800-193 document, just because it provides a nice overview of the full operating system, and it's a bit generic, so it covers, like if this was using OpenTitan or something else for the security board, like Nitro for AWS or TPM, and goes up the stack. And so you might have different attestation sets. And so, so you might have the RIV one from TCG, and then you might have one on the operating system. You might have one on a container. And some of those may come from different places, right? So that might be against a CIS benchmark for the operating system or the container or for the application, or could be against a DISA-STIG or some other NIST document. And you'd want to be able to note that in your attestation set, your attestation for the attestation set before you transfer that over to a GRC system. Next slide, please. And so what this draft does is it establishes that as a pattern to get people to think about, how do we do this at scale, and how do we look at remote attestation? And, I'm just trying to do this before we get too far down this path, so people could start thinking in this way, and maybe even make an improvement upon, what I've suggested. And with that, I think we're going to need to define some claims. And I put together an early table just to suggest some ideas. And I'm hoping with collaboration, we can build that out and make this something very useful, and make it so that we can get to that easy button for customers, or for, all organizations of all sizes, really. So that's it. Any questions? Okay, Jessica's in the queue.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
I had a question about attesting to configuration states. And just in my experience with SCAP, I know the amount of information they collect is huge. And I'm not certain how that would work in an attestation environment, unless you were thinking maybe of having a like a on-the-box comparison to policy, and then you attest to either yes, you're conform to the policy, or no, you're not conformant to the policy? Or were you envisioning something different?
So there has been some testing of this, and it may just be a yes or a no. But, I want to figure out how we can do this at scale. And while SCAP serves a purpose, it's not accessible to everyone. So, this is an effort to think about how do we go forward and improve things. So if I got some details wrong and some things should be remote.
Well, I think you could work with that, right? I think you could do that kind of attestation, and then if it turns out you're not conformant, right, then maybe you do something else. Like maybe there's a step B. I don't think that's bad. I kind of like the idea.
Okay, great. Thank you. And there might be, some values where you can do with attestation, and some that you have to do with other technologies. But if we can get further down the path of doing more with attestation and having it baked in, then,
the attestation of like the identity, the software, the firmware, that kind of thing. And then for configuration, maybe there's a multi-layer process sometimes. Okay, yeah, I like it.
Perhaps, but with a move towards how do we keep making this simpler and easier for those smaller organizations who are part of your supply chain if you're a big organization, or who just don't have resources even if they're not part of your supply chain.
Awesome.
Dave?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So I just want to reply to Jessica. I think there's at least two different categories of policy settings. One type of setting is things that might show up directly in claims. An example of that would be in EAT. There's your debug posture, and some types of debug posture are configuration, right? They're not just hardware settings, otherwise hardware settings, right? So some might appear directly in claims, right? There's another category of things that if all of your configuration for a particular category of stuff is in a config file, then you could do something like just setting the hash of the file, and if the hash matches, you know that all those settings are at the latest version of those configuration settings. So you could say all my configuration settings for category foo is in one claim with a hash value in it, and that's sufficient, and remediation is just pushing out the new policy file. Right?
Yeah, I guess my concern is when you're not.
If you've done, as long as you fit your policy into these categories. So.
Yeah, I think my issue would be when you're not conformant. Now, how do you do that sort of walk back to know where you went wrong? But I think that's something we could tackle. I just think it requires some thought, and I think this is on a path towards getting that conversation going.
Yeah, at the remediation level, that's outside of attestation, right? But if you just want to be able to know that, my point is if you split it up into categories, one category has a hash, and you can say which hashes are good and which hashes are bad. And you don't need it on a per setting basis, my point.
Right,
Yeah,
I
so
want to be sure, though, that we are enabling that kind of remediation later, because it doesn't, as a network operator, it doesn't do me a damn bit of good if I can't fix the problem, right? So just let's think about the problem that way, in a way of setting up how we can address the issues that we find. That's all.
Yep, that makes sense. So I think what we could start is by adding in a section, that talks about this, that, using a hash, to Dave's point, and then leave this as an open question to work through and figure out what options do we have and how can we do this in a way that scales, to Jess's point. So thank you. I appreciate the feedback. Guy?
Hi, Kathleen. I wondered if you have looked at how this idea intersects with some of the material in Eric's trusted path routing document. I know the title would imply that Eric's document is about routing, but it actually includes a proposal for his so-called trust vector. A way to summarize attestation, to detail the attestation results and turn it into something that is more easily consumed by all of the different parties that might want to know what the security state of the device is. And it sounds like that might be a component in what you're looking for here. That is,
Perhaps.
to have
So
a vendor.
I didn't think of it for the reasons that you're stating. And if it was device focused, I guess I was thinking about systems.
Yeah, so I think the way I look at it is Eric's suggestion is that not that this is wired into spec language, but that a vendor is likely to be able to do the best job of attesting a particular vendor's device. But the result of that attestation ultimately could go to a lot of different parties who are only interested in not what was the value of the PCR, but was that router okay? So he's proposed summarizing all of the thousands of bits that might come out of an attestation result into a short vector that says, hardware, we've checked it out, it's okay. The firmware looks like it's okay, so on and so forth.
Okay, so I'll have to take a look. It might make sense to merge these ideas. I would have to see a title change too, because of all of the assumptions we made, and then also your focus just on devices. So people with, who are doing client and server systems wouldn't necessarily go to a document focused on devices and think it's appropriate for them, right? So I think that's what led me to believe it would be a good idea to present this. And even if this doesn't go forward as a draft, I'd like the idea to go forward. And then having had the opportunity to present it, to just get this thought put forward for client systems and servers, and not just the device focus, right? And I think some of that is devices are a little simpler. So we're seeing more work come forward with attestation on devices and looking at, how do you secure the entire device? So I wanted to get something out there for client and server systems, and how do we go up the stack?
Okay. That's good. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric.
Yes, I'm very happy to see your draft. I read it, and I had the same thought Guy did. The trustworthiness vector does apply also to systems. The goal is to have, independent of routers, just a statement of claims that could be made about conclusions out of the attestation results and sort of summarize them. Happy to talk with you and others offline, because we have been thinking about turning them into EAT claims as well. So we can chat about that when you're ready.
Okay, great. And then this would also consider levels. So you might, if you look at, let's say, the CIS controls, you might only attest to the implementation group 1, where you get 85% risk reduction, or you might attest to implementation group 2, which improves your risk reduction, or implementation group 3 if you're looking for, a really secure system.
Yep, the goal, I hope, is to ensure that we have a set of claims that can be defined per device, and then or per system, and then you'll know what types of claims are allowable for that system type and what the valid values would be for that system type. So you have standardized claims, and then you'd be able to say for this type of system, this is the kind of expected values that which might be allowed.
Okay, so we'll have to look at this and also consider the differences between devices and systems and figure out if that means the same draft or if it means, you know, with just separate sections, or if it's too complex and just because devices and systems are so different, you know, does it mean two drafts? And I'm open to whatever.
Works for me. And we've also made the trustworthiness levels and vectors segmented, knowing that this day would come. So it's been made to be pulled out.
Okay, great. All right, so
We need to move
let's talk
on.
offline.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your feedback.
Thank you. So RATS architecture is up next. Dave, are you there?
All right, I do have an update on one slide, which will appear in the proceedings, but I'm just going to talk to it verbally when I get there, which is feedback from Michael. Michael is actually, I think, presenting in another session right now, so I'm presenting this one. This is discussion on draft 10 of the architecture document. Next slide. So we had a working group last call that was started after IETF 109, and we had a bunch of reviews from Eric and Guy and Thomas and probably some others I'm forgetting, and all of those comments were addressed in 10. Kathleen Moriarty did a document shepherd review just after the document deadline, so Kathleen's comments are not done in -10, they're done in -11 after this meeting. We have a GitHub repo if you're new, and we've had roughly weekly design team meetings, although like we took the holidays off, but we've had roughly weekly design team meetings ever since IETF 109. And we had a large number of GitHub issues, and I'm happy to report that we've had 71 GitHub issues closed since the last meeting. And so the only ones left is the one that is Kathleen's new feedback. And so we made lots of great progress in the weekly design team meetings since last IETF. Next slide. Now here's a summary of the things that changed. There's many editorial improvements that I'm not going to go through, but those were non-technical changes, but significant number of editorial improvements to clarify what was meant all along and word things better and so on. One structural change that you might immediately notice if you try to do a diff between 07, which is the draft as it appeared at 109, and 10, the current one, is that the use cases moved before the terminology section, and this was in response to some reviews that I think Hank solicited in terms of what was readable and understandable by people that had not been involved in the rat stuff. And so the use cases now try not to use the terminology as much as possible and just use layman speak. And then the terminology comes in after that and covers, you know, the rest of the architecture using the terminology. So that was a structural change in response to actually usability or readability reviews. One of the technical additions had to do with more exposition of reference values and reference value providers, right? So before IETF 109, we'd already introduced the distinction between an endorser and a reference value provider. That distinction may or may not exist in an actual implementation, meaning those could be combined into one implementation, or could be two separate implementations, or even two separate services you might subscribe to. But there was a couple places that we missed in terms of that separation. And so we fixed all of those, except for we found one more after the draft deadline, and that's what's in an open pull request right now. And so there's a little bit of discussion on there if you were to look in there between Ned and me, and the summary is that this has to do in the layered attestation section, where it previously incorrectly showed that you had an endorser for every layer in a layered attestation. And the pull request tries to fix that to say, okay, only the hardware needs an endorser, but all the layers in a layered attestation may need reference values in order to appraise them. And so you may have a reference value provider, or at least a set of reference values per layer, but really only an endorser for anything that's hardware, right? So that's the resolution. It's just not merged yet. That would be in draft 11. All And then the other thing that's actually the majority of the diffs between 7 and 10 is the expanded freshness section and the details of the handles approach, which started to appear before 109, but a lot more information was added between draft 07 and now. So that's what I want to spend some time on one slide. So next slide. And so this is actually most of my presentation here is this slide. I think I've only got maybe one more after this. So for freshness, there's really 3 styles of approach. And again, RATS does not constrain which protocol that you're using or even which style you're using for freshness. And so we say when you're going to use something in the RATS architecture, you're going to have some protocol and it's going to have some mechanism. Right, and there's some, reference interaction models that we have in other documents and so on. But the point is the architecture covers all 3 styles of approach, not by constraint, just to say, here's 3 things that might be typical when you're designing a solution. And all 3 of these are okay. And they have different trade-offs. So let's walk through what the trade-offs are. And the primary additions are in that 3rd category at the bottom here under handles. But it's useful to compare against the other 2. So let's walk through them here so you can do that comparison. So the first approach is to use synchronized clocks. And so freshness, how do you know that something hasn't been replayed? How do you know that the evidence is something that was generated fairly recently and not, 3 weeks ago under a different boot cycle or whatever? So where things have changed. So how does the entity appraising evidence or the entity appraising attestation results know that that evidence or attestation results are fresh? Okay, so the first one is synchronized clocks. Okay, and so of course that means that you'd have to have clocks, right? Where some IoT devices may not even have clocks if you're a sensor mode. You have to have some means of synchronizing them that's secure, something like NTP-SEC, for example. Could be other variations based at other layers and things, but that's one example that IETF folks might be familiar with. You have to have some time source to synchronize to that you actually trust, so you have a dependency on some other party. And then finally, you need to have typically additional claims about your time sync in your evidence, like you need to be able to claim that you actually got them from a particular time source that the relying party or the receiver of that evidence, the verifier, might trust. Okay. And so you might have to have additional claims that are in there. So your set of claims gets slightly bigger, okay, than not having synchronized clocks. Second category is to use nonces. Well, here a disadvantage is you need an extra round trip to acquire the nonce because you can't generate the evidence or you can't generate the attestation results without having the nonce to stick in it, right? So you need this extra round trip. So there might be higher latency, okay? If you generate a nonce, you actually have to store that nonce so that when the evidence of the attestation results arrives to see if it has the nonce. You've got a state requirement for every attestation. You have to generate a nonce and store it for some period of time that might be significant in some use cases. And so there's the highest state requirement is here and the highest latency requirement is here. You also need some mechanism on the nonce generator, such as a local clock, but only on whoever generates the nonce, to expire the nonces. How do you know if that nonce is stale, right? If you need to say that it's fresh within a particular period of time, you got to expire the nonce, right? The person that uses the nonce to sign stuff and includes it in there doesn't need a clock, but whoever generates the nonce needs a way to expire them. And then finally, in some cases, you might need the ability to distinguish the age of a claim value from the age of the claim in the message. So for example, if you had a GPS location that was acquired on boot and then you signed the evidence, 3 days later, right? Is that still valid because there's a distinction between when the evidence was generated at attestation time and when the GPS or when the claim value was first measured and then cached or something like that. And so if you need to know the difference, then you need to design some way to distinguish that because you can't just put a timestamp in there. And so we talk about an example of how you might do this in the appendix. And then the third category is the one that's really fleshed out. To contrast with the other 2 there, handles like the first one, we need some third party to synchronize time source to. Here you need some third party to distribute the handles. Now I say third party, but in theory the third party could actually be combined with one of the other parties, just like your trusted time source could in theory be combined into the same device as one of the other ones there too. So I say third party, but it's really talking about a third party in the sense of how many roles are there, right? To send them periodically, so here the handle distributor needs a clock because it has to send them periodically. And so it has to know how to figure out a period, right? But the receivers don't have to have clocks. They don't have to have state, like nonces and stuff. And so this one has a lot of nice properties compared to the other two because the disadvantages aren't there. And I'll talk about secure in just a second because that's the one elaboration point. But you also need to deal with some mechanism to deal with the loss of the handle distributor availability, right? Because if you don't have a local clock, how do you know that the handle distributor is still reachable? If you just haven't gotten something from them yet, how do you know whether they're still there? So you need to design some way to deal with that. So let me say what the elaboration is that would appear in the slides and the proceedings that's not on here. So first point, Michael wanted me to clarify what we mean by a secure means of distributing them. Because we do spend some time in the security considerations section talking about this. So integrity is obviously important, that the handle is the correct handle, that the origin is authenticated, so you know that they came from the correct handle distributor. Because what happens here is the handle distributor sends the same handle to both entities, the sender and receiver of the evidence. The sender of the evidence includes the handle, and the receiver of the evidence checks it against the handle it got, right? That's how the handles work. So it can't be spoofed. And the harder part is it can't be replayed, okay? So you might have to have a mechanism that distributes them that takes care of replay protection. But the one thing that you can't easily defend against unless you start adding additional things like local clocks and things is how do you deal with delay attacks? And so let's say that you could somehow introduce a large delay between the handle distributor and the handle receivers, then you could expand the freshness window, the window of how old can things be to whatever value that you wanted. And so you could do replay attacks within that if you could do delays of handles on both sides. And so you'd have to design some way of dealing with that, that we don't say how you do that, but you could potentially do it with local clocks. I saw Brendan jumped in queue and then jumped out. I don't know if I just addressed his question. So go ahead, Brendan.
About to put it on the chat, but I'll ask anyway. So are handles PSKs? Because that's the only way that this makes sense to me. So I'm just curious as to how this works.
You can think of it as a PSK, yes. I think the term handle, I think, came from Hank. And so I don't know if Hank wants to answer, but it is a unpredictable value that is known to both parties. And to most people, that is synonymous with PSK. So
hi, this is Hank.
Makes sense to me now. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay.
go ahead, Hank.
Yeah, okay, but maybe I can answer a little bit about Hannes' question instead. So he's asking relative time or absolute time. This depends on the provider. You typically want to have a tie into a global time. If you do a relative time, you create your own epochs starting by 0 and have not a global timescale here. In theory, that is possible in a limited domain. Practically, what we have encountered today in implementation is tie-ins with the global timescale, but I could see something built on relative time only in a certain domain. Then you have to take care of synchronizing your whole domain, and you will never have a help from a universal timescale like UTC Global.
Yeah, in general, the only category that requires absolute time is typically the synchronized clocks one. Unless you're trying to use it for, logs or something like that, then you might want synchronized clocks anyway. But, all right, thanks, Hank. Russ, I guess you're in queue next.
Hi, I have a real problem with the name handle. There is the handle system from, BobCon fame that the IETF really did not want to turn into a standard. So there's an informational RFC. 3650, I think. DOIs and things like that are all based on it. I think we can avoid the name collision. I think we should.
Would you believe, Russ, would you be okay if we used Brendan's suggestion of calling them a PSK?
Sure, absolutely. Those we know what are.
Okay, so it's a PSK generated by a third party and then distributed to two entities that are using it. So.
Yes, and we also know that you have to distribute them in a manner that all the people in the middle can't see them, as opposed to nonsense, right?
Yep, yep. Hank, did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, just only quickly, why I see names conflict with handles, I also need inconsistency with a secret that is not secret. So PSK, yeah, well, it is distributed as such, but it is not secret necessarily, so therefore intrinsically something different, potentially. But we can do the name roulette offline.
So one of the questions that Michael had asked is, do you actually need confidentiality with handles? Okay, and the document right now does not say that you need confidentiality. I have not thought of any reason why you need confidentiality, and I think one of Hank's original use cases was the handles are actually broadcast to everybody, right? You can't predict them until the epoch comes, so they're unpredictable. But once you're in that epoch, if they're public, that's okay as far as we know. So confidentiality is not needed, and that's why probably the term secret is not required here. All that's needed is that you can't predict it until the epoch comes. Brendan, did you have a follow-up? So you're back in queue.
So this is a broadcast nonce with a limited time of validity. Is that the idea?
Whether you broadcast it or whether you unicast it to two people is up to the protocol. When you say distributing, it could be any of those. It could be broadcast, it could be unicast to one entity or two entities. One if you happen to be one of the two entities yourself. So broadcast.
But effectively, it's a changing random value.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
It is like a nonce that is distributed a priori and can be reused across all the messages within that same epoch, as opposed to nonce, so it's a separate one per message.
Then maybe what you actually mean is it's an epoch ID.
Yes, it's an unpredictable epoch ID. Correct.
And there might be some other opaque content in that, let's call it handle for now, that's more than an ID.
Yeah. But by the way, this is the real content of the presentation, is this one slide. So even if we don't get past this slide, then we're okay. So I see Michael has actually made it to this meeting. So do you have a comment on this, Michael?
Yeah, I'm just tied into like 3 or 4 meetings. That's my problem. I'm actually not even convinced that the epoch ID or whatever we're going to call it, I'm not actually convinced that we have a way of the recipient validating the integrity of it. So I really I'm imagining when I heard about handles as a distinct from nonces, I was really imagining something like, a GPS satellite, tells everybody in the world it. And I can't see how we would validate that as being the legitimate GPS satellite, except that if you use the wrong one from the wrong guy, I guess you have to retry.
So one of the things that's in the draft right now, Michael, is that you require origin authentication. And so whatever your distribution mechanism, whether it's broadcast or unicast, right, it has to be signed by the handle distributor or the epoch ID distributor, if you want to use that term, right? So origin authentication is required and integrity is required. And so if it's signed with his key, for example, and everybody else has the public key of that handle distributor, then you have integrity and anti-spoofing.
Okay, I mean, I think I understood that at some point, and I guess I'm looking forward to an implementation draft of some kind to explain how we do this. And I think there's major how do devices get this kind of thing, given that they might not yet be on a network where they can actually download I guess a public key, it's got to be, to validate this. Although I could imagine some symmetric key mechanism like S key, or I guess the other word is it's not Merkle tree, but there's another variation of that where you like hash-based signatures, I think. But anyway, regardless of that, you got to know how to validate it, and So I can imagine, round trips between the tester and the verifier, where the verifier actually just has to somehow feed it data to validate it, at which point you might as well use the nonce.
Yeah, so the point of putting this, that all three in the document, and I know Michael's been in these meetings, but this is partly us on kind of a panel between the editors here, between Michael and me and Hank that are talking to just share our thoughts with everybody else here. That part of the architecture document's point is to share that there are these three styles of approach. When you're designing a solution, you got to pick one or more, but typically one, and flesh it out and say how it works. But if you're going to design something to work with attestation, then you should be aware that there's these different styles of approach and different solutions that you might have to be sort of agnostic as to which one of these are, because there's different trade-offs here, right? You're trying to optimize for state or latency or minimize dependencies or whatever, and you pick a different approach here in any particular solution. This is just the architecture, not the solution document. So yeah, everything you said, Michael, is right.
And Dave, I'll just add for the rest of the group. So in the 6-dish space, we actually have a beacon, extendable beacon, that actually would handle this thing very well, and even has pretty much all the properties that you can use it, and you can use it without knowing how to authenticate it, because you authenticate it later. You figure out afterwards when you succeeded that you actually succeeded with the correct thing, but you kind of have to do a little bit of a leap of faith initially to get there, but then you validate afterwards. So I don't think it's crazy. Russ, I guess we'll find another word for this. I think I'm happy with that too.
I put in chat the pointer to SKey.
Cool.
One thing on the handle, it does have some different properties than nonces. If you're with routers and you have thousands of people trying to connect, the handle scales a lot better with the hardware than the nonce. I wouldn't say that they're equivalent in terms of scalability.
Yeah, that's my whole point, that nonces have a huge state requirement. Handles, you might only be storing one or typically two, potentially three, but normally you'd be storing 2 handles total, independent of the number of people that you talk to. And so handles scale far better in state, right? Nonces, the disadvantage is state and latency. Synchronized clocks and handles, the disadvantages relying on a third party. And synchronized clocks, disadvantages, you got to have clocks in all the entities. All right, that looks like a hint from Ned that he wants me to move on. So Brandon, I guess you get the last comment here, but.
Well, so I was letting it go because this is a good discussion.
Okay, gotcha.
So
yeah,
why don't we
see
give
this
you
the last slide? I'm only going to spend 30 seconds on the last slide, so.
Good. Yeah, I was going to say, given that we, have 25 minutes of the open mic, I was letting it run.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. Thanks, Nancy.
I was just going to give you a couple more minutes. All
right.
Because
so
there are more presentations. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me spend my 30 seconds right now, and then we can just use any queue time for until you want to cut us off. So the 30 seconds on this one was all of our normative references are to RFCs. Hey, Roman, nothing is depending on. And informative references, we added a bunch of informative references. The one of note is that the Confidential Computing Consortium has a deep dive white paper that references our architecture document, and our architecture document references the deep dive white paper in the use cases section. So it's nice that we have parity or symmetry between the two documents, that the two organizations are in sync. Yes, I had something to do with that, full disclosure. I chair the Technical Advisory Council, and people like Thomas Wasadi and Eric Voigt, who've also been part of all the weekly design meetings, are also part of the CCC discussions. So that's my 30 seconds. All right, now we can go back to the previous slide if Brendan has other comments. So.
Yeah, so I'm trying to understand the use cases for handles. Now, in particular, I know you've just gone through the trade-offs, but I want to just sort of take a step back for a moment. Synchronized clocks versus handles, I think, are probably the most relevant thing, because your handles, as near as I can tell, are a synchronized clock. It's just a question of how synchronized and how precise your synchronization is. If you're distributing...
The handles don't give you any notion of absolute time, so it's not like you get a time that you can put into a log that's trusted. You get
no, but it's a proof of freshness.
Yeah. It's also handles are also less precise than synchronized clocks. So with synchronized clocks, you can say, I have a reason to believe that the evidence is exactly 5 minutes old, plus or minus the drift in the synchronized clocks, right? As opposed to handles, if your epic is every 15 minutes, I just know that it's within my 15-minute interval, but I don't know when.
Right. No. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. Yes. So the point I'm making is that handles are synchronized clocks. The question is whether they provide you anything more than yes, no, or do they give you ordering? So they don't give you ordering. The question is, why
a very
not?
Weak property of ordering. They only give you a very weak property of ordering. So I said that you'd store like 2 handles, right? And this is the example that's used in the freshness section, right? So you might know that they're using the previous handle or the current handle in the middle of a change.
So the point I'm trying to get to here is that if it de facto is a weakly synchronized clock, which is what it looks like to me, why not just use a weakly synchronized clock? Why go through the extra hassle? Why make it harder than it needs to be? Because what you've done is constructed
you to have a local clock.
You always have a local clock.
Hardware dependency that does not exist in the handles.
Everything has clocks. Show me a microcontroller without a clock. Notwithstanding those weird clockless ones that no one uses.
I will show you multiple very large devices that don't have trusted clocks in the TPU space.
Trusted clocks are a different thing.
So if you're trying to use them for attestation, and you're trying to attest for the level of a TEE, you need now this is only one of the use cases, right? The TEE use case, right? But for that use case, you'd have to have a trusted local clock.
But the point I'm trying to make is that the handles that you're using have all the same requirements as a synchronized clock. The only thing they don't have is an expiry time. If you were to use, as I said, a weekly synchronized clock gives you the same benefit.
Guys, we need to move on because now we are getting close to not completing our agenda.
Thank you, Brandon. Let's continue this discussion. And I'm sure Hank has views because the handle stuff came from Hank, so I want to make sure Hank is involved in these discussions. So, all right. Thanks, Nancy.
Thanks, guys. Okay, Hank, I think you're up next. Sorry, Ned, I'm just trying to keep time for the clock. I think it was a good discussion on the architecture, but we now need to move forward with the rest of the agenda.
Okay, does this work? Oh my God.
Yes, we hear you.
Render my hair gray in this light. Hi all. So hi, this is Hank. I'm going to present about 3 IDs we have here in reds. Every presentation will be a single content slide, so expect this to be a discussion or a time saver, mostly. First slide is about the reference interaction models ID that was adopted by the working group after the last meeting. Next slide, please. I have to somehow remove more. Too many messages. They clutter the desk at some point. There's an update here with respect to. I can use the next slide. Thank you. With respect to proof of concept running code. There's some lagging here. I need my slides actually. Oh, and there's a typo in an email address. Could you please? Thank you. What I was about to say was, there is a new implementation here available on GitHub, version. I don't speak French very well, so I guess that's similar to version. That's the color of grapes during the ripening from green to red. So it's Go implementations and other items there on that repository. It's an organization actually with multiple repositories and one hackathon demo, which provides containers, and we have to thank, I think Thomas is here and Yogesh, for example, ARM employees who are doing this. So thank you a lot for hacking at this. This complements basically both are using the challenge response interaction model from this document here. And also, again, there was feedback coming from preliminary implementation from that domain, so to speak, and we got a few good results here. There were no conceptual issues with the draft. It was actually helpful during implementation as the middle piece of the abstract thing, that's the architecture, and well, the implementation itself. So it's a good middle ground as we intended it to be. There are now 20, as a working group item, there are now 20 open GitHub issues. Thanks for them. This is like a barrage of super useful points to talk about. Some of them actually not easy to reply ad hoc. So please have a look at this. This all tends to somehow prepare for working group last call, of course. So as the conceptual parts are relatively stable, I think, from what feedback we already got, these are mostly editorial, or if it's just confusing content, and the question is, does that belong into this document? So please have a check for the issues, and reviews of the whole document are, of course, welcome. I know that there had to be some privatization here before IETF, and other IDs won here in this group. So maybe in the next round, there will be room for this ID. And yeah, that's basically my report. If there are any questions about this, I will wait a few seconds. Otherwise, we can move on to the next presentation, which is TUDA. So you heard, you probably in the past meetings and session and interims, you've heard TUDA mentioned as a reference. TUDA is an implementation, as a specification draft, sorry, and an implementation with respect to the unidirectional remote attestation as depicted as one of the interaction models in the previous ID. Next slide, please. And the latest updates to this ID include alignment with the maturing documents here in this working group, primarily the architecture, RIV, and of course the interaction model. It's now all aligned. Old terminology was thrown out. Actually, there was some really old terminology in the, let's say, last third of the ID that was not touched recently. There are two major open questions. We provide a exemplary interface, reference interface for TPM 1.2. That's an old thing, but it's deployed in millions of devices today still. So we are considering maybe opening up the questions, do we want to keep that? Personally, I'm leaning a little bit towards, yeah, because people need it. But that would be an interesting question to be answered as a working group item. Then again, we have two types of reference interfaces here. One of them SNMP, thanks to Ira McDonald, and a Yang module also. Yang is the more cool kid on the block here in the IETF. So second question would be, do we need SNMP? Again, personally, I have a slight preference towards including both. But this could also be another item for working group discussion. So as the content seems rather complete and it just has to be pruned more and put into shape for an ISG process here, I would like to ask or formally request basically the chairs to do a working group adoption call, maybe if they even think the item is okay. And then we can go from there maybe as a working group adopted item now. So that's this slide here. Any questions or feedback on that? And maybe directed to the chairs, do you see an obstacle here, or do you want to take this offline to the list, the WGA question, sorry?
Well, I suppose we can run a quick poll to see how many people have read the draft. So let me put on the poll. Have you read this draft? Okay. Okay, let me run this for a minute. There's a poll running.
Can you update the wording to say, have you read this version, or have you read any version, whichever way you prefer?
I don't know if I can edit the poll now. I can start a new one. what version is the latest version? The latest version of the TUDA draft. Is that better, Dave?
I should maybe also look at that.
Okay, I'm going to give it 10 more seconds. Okay, so I see 4 people have raised their hands. 17 did not read the draft, explicitly said they didn't raise their hands. I guess of the 4 people who raised their hands, I should have clarified the question. Of the 4 people, since there were only 4 that raised their hands, I'm presuming the 4 were not one of the authors.
So
Hank,
I did
you
not
didn't
vote.
raise your hand?
No, I was watching it. It doesn't make sense to.
Well, that's why sometimes people will vote anyway. And as Hannes is noting, there are 4 authors. I want to make sure it wasn't the 4 authors. Okay, I'd like to get a couple more people to read the draft. What we can do is take it on the list and see if, see what Hannes has said. So let's take it up to the list and see if we can get a couple more people and get discussions going so that we can make the call for adoption if there's enough interest for this one.
And I can at least tell Hannes that at least two of the authors aren't here. So even if both authors voted, then there are 2 other people at the very minimum.
All right. Okay. So given that, let's move on to the next one.
Thanks, sure. So this might be the item that is. This might be the item that is a little bit more to the discussion point here for today. I hastily prepared this the slide deck. It is about the claim sets that we fleshed out based on the working items in the suit working group, which are the manifest and corresponding architecture and information model. Next slide, please. So the fundamental idea here is that software updates to the Internet of Things are vital to the trustworthiness of things, and might be services, might be devices, and all the things. And so there are now this idea includes, I think, a very proficient set of claims derived from these booting devices with new or old firmware components. And then reporting also about the update procedures during runtime before a reboot and a boot of a new firmware is conducted. There were some inconsistencies here on the 0.0, as it sometimes happens. These are fixed now. Brandon and I are relatively confident that the naming and the descriptions of all claims are quite okay right now. That said, some of the items described here in the claims set for attestation results and evidence for RETs will become a new ID in the suits working group, because the actual manifest that steers and executes the update and the resulting report will be separated. The reports will become a new standalone ID, just as an FYI. So not all of this will be in the items that are recently and will at the moment be moved to the ISG. We also have realized and came to the understanding in the course of the last half year that the claims here are very well fitted to fit into the same scope as the trustworthiness vectors that are defined in the trustworthy path routing ID from Eric. So we were talking about that and like designing and modeling how this fits for quite a while now. And now the authors decided, of both drafts, decided that we will create and break out a certain ID that is new, that will only encompass the trustworthiness vectors and the corresponding claims as described in the trustworthy path routing ID today. And we will bucket the suit claims also into that draft, which probably means that we will abandon this claims draft as it is right now, and we will recombine it into an information model about claims for trustworthiness, about trustworthiness that can be used primarily in attestation results, but also in evidence, we think, depending on the refinement of events created by an attester. So we assume that on both sets of conceptual messages, these claims could appear in or could be used in. And well, our plan is, well, after fleshing out the content today, to start anew and increase the scope here a little bit. This addresses, I think, some of the questions raised by Kathleen very early on about this could be just device-centric. People might not be looking at this. I actually share the same sentiment. And so, but from, I guess, a different point of view, to a different angle, but I think maybe we are converging towards a two-draft system here. One is the sets and the usage of the sets, and one is the claims set that will be made use of inside of these sets. This might make a lot of sense, maybe not. A little bit of more discussion might be interesting here, but I'm relatively optimistic that this is the right way to go. So for now, our next step is to combine portions of the TRP ID and the claims ID for suit into a new IM, and let's go from there. So are there any comments and or questions about this?
Yeah.
I see that
hi,
Lawrence
Lawrence.
opens his mic. Yeah, hi.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
So I was looking at the draft real quick, and I'm trying to understand the relationship to like EAT, CWT, or JWT. I mean, it seems like you can't just, or doesn't seem right to define claims in a vacuum without kind of saying what the framework for conveying the claims are. So, is this intended to be CWT claims, JWT claims, EAT claims? How is that relationship there? And wouldn't you have normative reference to one of those?
I think that EAT is a very direct candidate for a actual representation of these claims, to instantiate them in a format conveyed via protocol. We are calling them claims already, adhering to the architecture and therefore also to the EAT terminology. And yes, I think we could highlight at the very early beginning of the new idea that we are planning here, that these can be, for example, instantiated by an EAT. That's absolutely, I think, in scope. Luckily, because both conceptual messages, evidence, and attestation results are in scope of the current charter, and therefore also are covered by EAT, I think. Maybe EAT is more on the evidence side, but that is something we could flesh out along the way, how EAT and attestation results relates.
I mean, you understand, like, you just define a claim in the abstract, don't you need to pin that down into some sort of a system like JWT, CWT, or EAT? I mean, does it make sense to define claims without saying something like that?
No, I don't think it's necessary. This is basically about the assessment of the item in hand. So basically, it's the attestation result set. So initially, we thought it's actually not the core scope of EAT, first of all, but also then in the past like 4 months, we realized some of these could be directly created as evidence claims by an attester, so they could fall in the scope of each. And then for now, our working thesis is, yeah, these claims are useful for both sides, the conceptual type that is evidence and the conceptual message type that is attestation results. And I don't see a problem with defining claims here in the scope without a tie into a format. We could extend the information model part, and it's a little bit data model-esque in EAT at the moment, but we could tie into that. I actually included CDDL that is based on the EAT ID. So I think the threshold of saying somehow this can be used by EAT is very low.
Yeah, okay. And then we will be putting text into EAT that says it can be used for attestation results.
Yeah, and we have to really think a little bit about that. I think that is fine, but we also have to make clear, do we really want that? So that is not a decision made lightly, I think, but also I'm relatively optimistic that we will find a good way to phrase this.
Okay, we need to keep rolling. So Dave, if it's quick, we'll cut the queue at you.
Yeah, I assume that this presentation is about the draft protocols, the rat suit claims, although you didn't say that. And I just want to say that the TEEP working group depends on suit and rats. The TEEP protocol has a normative dependency currently on having the claims that are in the draft that I just mentioned, which I assume is the one that Henk is referring to. In which case, yes, what's blocking the implementation is actually getting values assigned for use in TEEP needs to use it in EAT. So to Lawrence's comment, TEEP is expecting those claims to appear in EAT, and it needs values assigned sooner than later. And so we hope that the RATS working group will do something with this to unblock for TEEP. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that input. So yeah, we will not rush this, but we will expedite a clear statement how claims in EAT could look like if you are really have a hard dependency here.
The TEEP session.
Excellent. I'm sorry, Dave. I just said TEEP session.
Yeah, when I present the TEEP protocol in the TEEP session, I'll talk about TEEP use. So if there anybody else that wants to discuss this more, we have a little bit of time in TEEP.
All right, can we move on?
Sorry. Sure. Thank you.
So can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. Okay, so I'd like to talk about UCCS. So if we can move on to the next slide. So the use case for UCCS is to convey a token, typically an EAT or something like it, over a secure channel that already authenticates both endpoints and provides integrity protection, and may optionally provide confidentiality. The essential idea behind this is that in many use cases, if you already have a secure channel, the battery overhead or the radio bandwidth overhead of further signing and or encrypting in the COSE form is essentially unnecessary from a security perspective. So in this case, we're assuming that the two endpoints, the attester and the verifier, are trusted in some sense. So examples might be a TE conveying attestation evidence to a service provider using TLS, or a global platform secure element using SCP-03 or SCP-11. These are secure channel protocols that provide essentially provide authentication and integrity protection, and usually also confidentiality. We can also consider that JWT already supports the algorithm none. From the perspective of security, we have limitations that we like to discuss and that are discussed in more detail in the draft. But essentially, the security properties of attestation evidence are only guaranteed when they're within the secure channel. If the attester and verifier are trusted, then the assumption is that the verifier is going to manage the attestation evidence in a trustworthy fashion, but that is somewhat out of scope. And then there are some discussions about the nature of privacy preserving secure channels and how to work with those. So the document was published in a 01 and 02 draft. Most of the comments were made on the 02 draft. So if we move to the next slide, I've tried to go quickly through the comments that we've received and how they have been addressed. So the comments from Russ, the must requirements have been rewritten both to clarify them and to reduce the strength. And we note that integrity protection is only provided in both directions where confidentiality is needed. From Jessica, Fitzgerald McKay and Mike Jenkins, we had essentially 4 comments, 3 of which have been addressed, and 1, which was the comment that a static symmetric key can only authenticate a net, not an entity. I haven't been able to come up with a good answer to that, other than to say I don't think it's important in respect of this specification. It applies in many other scenarios where cryptography is used, and we don't address quite that nuanced distinction. Others seemed to agree in the discussion on mailing list. So next slide. So we had from Lawrence, there should be a minimal discussion of security, and I'm afraid, Lawrence, that the coverage in draft 3, which Henk put out, I think, yesterday, is actually fairly extensive, largely because of the feedback that we received from others. It certainly goes beyond where I had envisaged going. So Jim Shad had requested that we have some more detailed correspondence of secure channel security with equivalent COSE objects, and that is something that we have tried to cover. So we can move on to the next slide. And this is really the meat of what I'm asking. We need to find an appropriate working group for UCCS draft to be completed. The proposal that I have, and I think is supported by the other authors, is that we should do this work in RATS because it's where the experts and the interested parties are. We believe that it is in scope because the main use case that is driving the specification arises within RATS, and in particular, the driver for creating the specification came from work that I'm doing based on the RATS work inside Global Platform, and that I am doing equally inside a collaboration that involves the Trusted Computing Group. And so that's sort of from my perspective, it seems like the right place to do this, and to ensure that we remain aligned with RATS fully in terms of the entire model. Other proposals, so Jessica proposed COSE. Jim Shad was quite strongly opposed to that. His feeling was that within the COSE working group, the correct answer to UCCS would be you should use COSE. Ira also was against, and both Jim and Ira suggested as an alternative ACE. I would, as I say, myself, and I think on behalf of the authors, we feel that RATS is more appropriate given that it ties very specifically to work that's being done in other bodies based on the open standardization work that RATS is doing. So I guess if we move on to the next page.
Want to take the questions in the queue first before you move on?
Sure. No, that's fine. We can do that.
Okay, so Dave Thaler, who's there? First.
That was from before. I meant not being you. Go ahead.
I guess that makes it me. We considered doing something very similar to this in Suit, and we eventually got a security review which told us that this was a bad idea for Suit. And I'm just going to give you the sort of the rundown of why that was. I'm not exactly sure if it applies equally in this context. So the concern was that in Suit specifically, the idea was that a document that describes only channel information could be authenticated by an existing secure channel. Not anything else. So things like signing off on exact firmware content wasn't allowed, but just channel information. And the feedback that we were given was that this would allow an attacker that successfully compromises the channel security to pivot very quickly through your network and then take over other things, because it would allow them to issue requests through that channel. And so in the end, we actually removed that because it removed some defense in depth and introduced a new possibility of an attacker pivoting rapidly. So I guess this came back to the standard cryptographic doctrine of using one key for one purpose. So I guess I would ask you to consider whether that applies to this scenario as well.
So we've certainly done a reasonable amount of analysis ourselves. I think that it's something that is perhaps open for further discussion within this use case, because it is for the conveyance only of attestation evidence. I think there is a question as to what an attacker could do if they took control of the secure channel, other than to tamper with the attestation evidence itself. I think that any attack then becomes a little bit second order. But so I think the use case here is slightly different in that there's no direct control of system behavior, but clearly there is likely to be an indirect control aspect. But the whole option, the whole approach is optional, and it does. I mean, the major use case that we see at Global Platform is in the case of secure elements, and here we're talking about an EAL4 plus hardened security environment. So something which is, whether rightly or not, is inherently believed to be reasonably secure against attack. So I don't know if that helps to answer the question.
So I do appreciate all of that. All I'm suggesting is that if this is a key that can only be used in one situation, I'm sure it's fine. But if you've got keys that can be reused across multiple use cases, then this becomes more concerning.
Now, in this case, and within all the scenarios that we're considering, essentially the key material is used only to secure the the transport. Anyone else in the queue? I'm not sure. I don't know how to
Lauren?
do that.
Yeah.
And then Hank.
So this is an example of one of the reasons why I think there should be less discussion about security. I know the horse is kind of dead, and I don't want to beat it anymore, but it's just an example of, this is not a protocol that has any keys in it. This is just saying we're not using keys. So, it seems like Brendan's discussion should be in the document that describes the protocol that has the keys. It shouldn't be in this UCCS document. And that was why I was saying there should be less coverage about security. Anyway, that's kind of informative. Second comment is quite happy to see this adopted in RATS. And third comment is I have done an implementation of this.
That's interesting to know. So thanks, Lawrence.
Yeah, and, so this is Hank, not trying to, again, also beat the dead horse. Sorry. This is, I think it's a good reason to tie this to rats then, first. And if some other application like Suite would do this, and they won't, as we just heard, they would write their own ID and tell people how to use it, or in this case, basically not use it. So I think that's the reason why we have to tie it to a scope and not just let it free floating without any security considerations. And again, I think, thank you, Brandon. That's an excellent reason why to tie it here to rats. Thanks.
Roman?
Okay, so if Hank is done, let me go. So I think blending what got said by the previous speakers, and I haven't scrubbed the document itself, it seems like we have a couple of different options. It sounds like we can come up with a general purpose claim. And if we have a general purpose claim, we would need to cover all of the dimensionality of the attack surface to include what came up in Suit, what potentially could come up with rats, and to future-proof people misusing it in some other way. And that's, I think, a very different document. The alternative here is we could say, hey, we want to leverage kind of CBOR for a very specific application specific way. It will preclude uses outside of the rats use case the way it is documented, but it will work with the assumptions of the deployment environment kind of in rats. And that's another document. I think the latter clearly fits into rats. It makes a lot of sense. From my view, we might need to talk a little bit more about where the general purpose one would go if that's the route we wanted to take, and how to appropriately document all the caveats with that particular claim. From my kind of squint at that document, it feels like you're leaning towards this idea of a narrow use case specific claim where you would caveat that you can't use it outside of the deployment environments that we have here in rats, right?
That's more or less what the text says today. Maybe it could be stated more strongly, but it basically says if you're not using this in rats, it's your problem.
Yeah, if we keep to that scope, it would make sense to me at least to keep it in this working group.
So thank you. I'd like to just get a show of hands on interest of this draft. And so I just started a quick poll. And then if you have reasons against, please put that in the chat so we can collect that quickly. We're running short on time.
Okay, so as a relatively new attender, I assume that authors do not raise their hands here.
Usually it's a hum in a room and nobody would know, and they might.
Okay, that's fair enough.
All right, so I'll let this go another minute. I would like to see a threat model for this document. Is there one already? Was a question asked. Somebody else told them to do it.
Currently, there is not a threat model beyond the fact that we have tied the usage to rats, and therefore the rats threat model, I think, would be applicable. But maybe that could be fleshed out further.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll and see how this went. All right, so 14 support and 3 do not. So that's pretty good. We can take this to the list, especially since we're running short on time, and we can do it more formally there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, this is Eric. I'm going to talk about the threat model, sorry, the Chara model. We have done a number of updates since the last IETF. The biggest change has been getting the first set of Yang Doctor reviews, and I'm going to do an update on where we're at. Next slide. Just a recap on the purpose, the idea here, especially for network equipment like routers and switches, we want to go ahead and be able to do things like get TPM PCRs and log entries in order to validate what has actually been stored in the TPMs and validate the attestation of those devices. This is really a Yang model for the remote procedure calls in order to get the information out of that device. Next slide. There's a relationship to a number of other drafts. It inherits all the RATS language from the architecture doc. It inherits the context from the draft that Nancy talked about earlier on the network device attestation. And it has some drafts which are also inputs like the reference interactions. So there is a whole bunch of context prior to the Yang model that's embedded. That's why the text is fairly small. We tried to limit, to the degree possible, the draft just to that Yang model. There are a couple drafts that are follow-ons to this. For example, there's a device subscription model I'll talk briefly about after this. And there's been already several discussions today about the trusted path routing as it relates to the trustworthiness vector. Next slide. There were a few issues that were addressed from version 3 to version 5. We eliminated one type of quote that was made based on an older version of the TPM. Per last IETF, we said, does anybody use TPM 1.2 quote 1? Answer seems to be no. So we just eliminated that and nobody complained. We had other changes that we simplified the Yang model to do things like pull out information from within the signature element coming out of the TPMs so that we don't have redundant information exposed in the Yang tree. We also got a number of Yang doctor comments that were all covered, and we repartitioned the draft so that we had the Yang tree broken out to make it more readable. One last thing is we defined some example remote procedure calls so you can see how the quotes are retrieved. Next slide. Within the Yang model, there really aren't any open issues that I know of other than one we were talking about on the list just the last couple days saying, do we need to add some definitions to the Yang tree as it relates to where the binary sources of information are being defined. In other words, we need better references in a couple places to the source documents from the trusted computing group. There's also a fairly technical thing on XPath to make sure that the data validations are being done appropriately. And the first Yang doctor review didn't actually get to that. So we need a better Yang doctor review that will be done during working group last call. And that's all the open issues that at least I know of at this point. Next slide. Question of the working group is, are we ready for working group last call? We've passed the date where we were supposed to do working group last call. And a lot of the reason was we were waiting for the Yang doctor's review. I think the document is in a decent shape for working group last call. The one thing that is, I guess, interesting is that these are mostly people who cares about routers and switches. And the people who've done routers and switches have done a review. So getting a sufficient group of people saying, yes, we care to go to working group last call is the interesting question. But that's where we are right now with this document. If we're going to close it, we might as well close it because it seems fairly stable. I don't know how we can progress it beyond where we're at without going there. So I guess I'll open up the questions and thoughts from the chairs, but I think it's ready to go forward, and that's where we're at.
So Eric, did you update the draft along with your authors to include the feedback from the Yang doctor's review? And I thought you had mentioned some other comment with one more issue. Did I miss that, or?
Oh, no. The Yang doctors updates are all in there. They were posted quite a while ago when the Yang doctors came in. So those are all in there. There was one comment just in the last few days from Jürgen And as far as I think, sometimes it's a little hard to know what Jürgen's saying. I think it's actually covered in the text. The one comment that's still open is make references to some of the binary formats. And so as far as I can tell, the only thing that's needed is to get the references included for what some of the binary formats are. Some of them are inherited, and that we can make it a little bit more explicit. It really isn't a big deal. And then the XPath validations from the Yang doctors, if we claim that we're in working group last call, it will force them to answer that. And that's all I know about.
Okay, so I just started another poll. I want to get a sense of who has read the latest version of the Chara draft. I'll run it for a few seconds.
Of course, is that routers and switch people. There's fewer of them here, but we have to figure out a way to get that feedback.
Yeah, and I don't mind triggering, but I just wanted to get a sense here, and I should have said the author should not be responding to this.
I am not.
Okay, I'll give it another. And I think you're right. I mean, you've gotten feedback on the previous two versions, I want to say. Okay, I'll give it 10 more seconds.
And our author list is what, 7, 8? I can't remember.
Okay, so I will end the poll, and the results are, okay, so we've had 4 people, and you've had the Yang doctors, so I can go ahead and issue a working group last call. The question is whether we benefit by doing another solicitation to the Yang doctors, Eric, because I know you spent quite a bit of time with the previous one.
Oh, I have no problem asking them. I think we get a different response when we go to working group last call. And I've run working group last call with Yang models before. It is a separate process where they say, here are the things. So I don't see a problem in running them in parallel. In fact, you'll probably get a better response if it's in parallel.
Well, no, I mean, I can trigger another request.
Oh, that'd be great. Yep.
So before I triggered a request for an early review, this would be a working group last call review.
Yeah, and we can also do them have their working group last call, and then after the response come back. I mean, I'm just trying to close out our timeline. It's not like I'm rushing to have this complete, but I just want to make sure if it's stable, we complete it. Whether you want to have them get their answers and come back to working group, it doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, keep in mind that if we get a lot of feedback, we'll have to issue another working group last call.
Sure. Well, why don't we claim working group last call first to the Yang doctors and then bring back the results here. I don't think that they're going to have a lot of stuff other than XPath and others, but you never know.
Yeah. Yeah, Carson highlighted, and thank you, Hank, for making me look at the chat. Given that there are 8 authors in the draft plus 4 that raised their hands, I think we're ready to do the last call. And I will explicitly solicit feedback from the Yang doctors too for the last call. So
sounds great.
Okay, I think we can move on.
All right. The other one is just a verbal update for me on the attestation event stream subscription. Basically, all this draft does, excuse me, is once we're done working group last call on the Chara draft, this says how to actually subscribe to the results. There's a bunch of drafts over NetConf on how to subscribe to the information in the Yang model. And all this would be once we've gotten the Chara model complete, we might as well adopt something on Yang stream subscription. Now, there is a possibility of also including other types of things beyond Yang models in the event stream subscription. And we're just getting some interest outside of this, which is why I don't have any slides, or Hank doesn't have any slides. It is possible the scope is going to include more than Yang subscriptions. We're going to have to wait and see how that plays out. But this is more of a, once we have Charad done and locked, we might as well think about whether to adopt this as well. I didn't want to do any new information or adoption requests until we closed out the other. And that's just a simple update on where we are with this.
Okay. It sounds like if you're going to do something more than Yang, you'll need a little bit more time to bake that into the draft too. So.
Agreed. And that's why we're holding off on trying to assert what it might be until somebody comes up with a larger scope if we want to go there.
Sounds good.
And that's that.
Thanks, Eric. Okay. You gave us a little bit of time back. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Okay, I'm Lin Chen. This draft was first submitted in March last year. So far, we have updated it to version 3. So we have one chance to this presentation. In our draft, our main consider next slide. Thank you. Our main consideration from ISP perspective, we can cite 4 scenarios in which REST may be used. The point we are considering may not be quite the same with the use case in architecture, just from our possible requirements. Next. The first consideration is from our access authentication. We think there will be authentication centers with different mechanisms. For example, PSK-based authentication center and IBC-based authentication center. So when PSK center and IBC center, they cannot communicate directly. Maybe we can use REST to make the results of one center recognized on another. I don't sure if this scenario is belongs to REST. Next slide. The second consideration is from the application level. As we all know, the limitation of this resource, many applications need operators to provide business authentication service. We simply divide them into certificate-based and non-certificate-based. So when cross-business authentication is required, can we use REST to prove one's identity to the other? Of course, we should have requirements for attestation results, a browser policy, the protocol to transmit the attestation results. Especially, we have to stress the security of the protocol. Next slide. And the third consideration point is about virtualization-based system. Virtualization system also use REST based on VTPN, but I haven't seen the work group drafts have mentioned it. So I have a question. Will work group cover the scope of virtualization? Next slide. The fourth consideration is about trust routing. Some customers expect expert ISP to be able to provide trusted link service. So we are faced with how to form trusted links internally and between ISPs. We thought maybe we could do it with RAS, routing devices as a tester and provide evidence or appraisal result to orchestrator. It depends on the detail of implementation. Of course, the precondition is routing devices support TPM 1.2 or 2 or other rebrand standards. Next slide. For trusted link issues, we consider these two specific scenarios. The one is add a new router to the network and how to form trusted link with 4 steps. The first step is to the new router provides evidence to the verifier. Maybe the orchestrator can shoulder for the role of verifier. And the second step is the verifier feedback the result. And step 3 is trustworthy assessment. Then the orchestrator can form routing policy and issues them. And step 4, after these 3 steps, the trusted link formed. Next slide. The other scenario is how to update the routing device's status. Maybe can collect routing information in real time or periodically. The information collected maybe include device information, log information, fault information, trusted measure vendors, and then forms a trusted link based on users' trustworthiness requirements. RAS is useful for routing devices that provide evidence to the orchestrator. Next slide.
Mei-Ling, you have somebody on the queue with a question?
Question?
Eric, you had a question, you're in the queue?
Yeah.
I see Dev said a question.
Yes.
Density-based authentication such IPC. Yes.
Yes. On the use cases, there are drafts that are identifying the use cases inside. For example, the trusted path routing defines the previous use case as well as a potential solution to it. Have you looked at these drafts, and do you have any thoughts on how those drafts might accomplish the use case that you're identifying here?
I'm sorry, I don't get your point exactly. Can you repeat?
For example, the routing use case. There is a draft on the routing use case that defines both the use case as well as how to solve it with network protocols. Have you had a chance to read the draft on the routing use case?
Do you mean the draft for the trustworthy vendor, that draft?
Yes, it does answer the how to build a trusted network. So the question is your draft looking to...
In the trustworthy vendor, this we keep them with your ideas.
So what is the purpose of this draft?
Especially the trustworthy assessment.
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to understand the purpose of this draft. There is a use case draft which exists that Michael has been stewarding. There's a deployment draft that is the protocols. So I guess my question is how are you trying to add new use cases to Michael's use case draft? Are you trying to define additional use cases? I'm just trying to understand what you're trying to do with this draft.
Okay, my title is about use case, but maybe it is not so exactly. We just give our consideration from our perspective. Your advice, our use case to be refined in the in your draft. Is that right?
Maybe not my draft. I'm thinking more of Michael's draft because Michael has a use case. Michael, maybe you can chime in because is this draft adding to your draft? That's what I'm feeling.
Okay, I understand your maybe it's a good advice because I do not know how the next step of my draft.
Well,
because
so
I'm not sure the use case or the consideration we have cured it is below to rest.
So, Roman, do you want me to read your comment? You're next in the queue, or?
I was just going to hop in. I mean, I wanted to reiterate kind of from a procedural kind of process. I'm thrilled we have concrete text in writing that couches use cases. We have a couple of them, and we have a new document here. Thank you for bringing it that tries to discuss potentially additional use cases. Having said that, I wanted to remind the working group that we are currently chartered not to publish any use case documents. So they are used primarily as we have the charter scope now to help inform the discussion, but they would not pop out as an RFC on the backside.
Oh, understand. I just want to ask, is there anyone interested about our contents? Maybe we can detail it together because the draft is not so perfect now. We have many things to do next. Any other questions?
No, so Mei-Ling, I would suggest that you take this up to the mail list. And
okay.
If you can clarify the purpose of the draft, as Roman just stated, right? The use cases are to instill the discussion for the solutions that are being put forward. The intent is for not to have the use case documents to actually be published as RFCs. So if you can make the purpose of what you're trying to achieve more clear and do it through the mail list, I think that will help us. Right.
Yes. Maybe the use case is the starting point we come to the rest, but we also want to do the deep research on the trust link.
Dave Thayer's on the queue.
Oh yeah, Dave, go ahead.
I think maybe I need to ask a couple questions about whether stuff was in rats in the first couple of slides, and I couldn't tell for sure, but I think the answer is yes to the various questions that you asked about whether something was appropriate for rats. I think I understood the first diagram. I didn't understand the second one, but out of the first 3 or 4 questions you asked, I think the answer is going to be yes, yes, and yes to the questions that you'd asked me. Right? So since it looked like you were looking for an answer from the rats working group, I just wanted to give an answer on behalf of at least one of the rats architecture authors that yes, I think that rats can be used for at least some of the scenarios that you mentioned. Eric commented on the latter ones, but I just wanted to help answer for the former ones. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, Mei Ling, Michael Richardson, who's one of the main editors for the use case draft, said he's happy to collaborate with you vis-a-vis the use case draft that's currently running, but noting Roman's comment on publication. So, so if we can take that to the mail list, I think that would be good.
Yes, thank you for that. And I have now I have idea for my use case.
Great. Thank you for presenting. Okay, so we have an illustrious 5 minutes left for the open mic. Okay, Hank, you're in the queue.
Yeah, sorry. I was so it was late. I was a little bit distracted with Meiling's question. So I think the very first diagram. So I also have to agree with Dave first. I think that's the easiest part. And then the first scenario very much looks like the composite device scenario. So I think it's an extension to the composite device multi-chassis section in the architecture, and maybe you can start from that for the first scenario. The second scenario with the two relying parties, one of them is a certificate and one a non-certificate. I might need a use case, like a user story, like what messages are actually involved here, what's the problem in the production environment that is solved. Because I could see, of course, a attestation result to some extent, if it's signed, could substitute a certificate somehow. But I don't know all the moving parts here. So I think the second scenario would benefit from a fleshed out use case scenario. And I unfortunately forgot the third item, but I will come back to this later on the list, I guess.
Okay, open mic time. Dave Thaler, you're on the queue. Thanks for that, Hank.
All right, open mic question. So I mentioned that the TEEP working group has a dependency on rats, right? Which was kind of the first best customer for rats, where another working group was taking dependency on it. I think Jeremy had talked about global platform and things, but my question for open mic time is: are folks aware of other IETF working groups that are looking at taking a dependency on rats? Some of you may remember during the BOF time, I had given a conjecture that every authentication use case was an attestation use case. And so there might be a large number of things that are potential customers. I just wonder, are there other things that might be normative dependencies coming in from other working groups right now? So there you go.
Excellent question. I'm not aware of any.
So can I answer the question, Michael Richardson? One thing which is not adopted and not well understood or accepted is in the deprive, the ADD working group, is that Tiro Reddy and I have a document on essentially an attestation as to the quality and privacy of the DNS server that you are going to talk to. And I've tried to make it clear that we should not be reinventing rat here. The working group doesn't really understand why it's an attestation and hasn't accepted the document at all yet. I would say, if anything, we have some explanations and evangelizing to do elsewhere as to what is attestation and why it's a useful thing.
I think you raise a good point, Michael. I guess I'm kind of scratching my head. I guess I'm not fully awake yet in how we could raise that awareness, because I think you're right. The question to you would be that if you need help with the ADD working group, how we could, in rat participation, help raise that awareness.
I would say that primitively, the simplest is we should get our documents published. That's probably one of the simplest ways to be able to do this and say, go read this, done. I think that perhaps it's just a question of making our use cases more easy to comprehend, and that may just mean we have some better slides that more people are using more commonly. So there's some value, I think, in common messaging here.
Okay. And I think with that, we are out of time. I will just highlight, Yari did post in the comment that he also has something similar in the, I'm presuming it's in the ADD group, Yari, Draft ARCO DNS Confidential. Okay, so with that, we're out of time. Thank you, everyone, and we will meet again tomorrow.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy.
Bye.